I'm Phil Harrington, and I'm very pleased to see you all here this evening. And I'm really thrilled to have this session. I emailed Margaret about 3 months ago and said that I'd heard there was a book. And I'd love to hear you talk about it when you get a chance. And Margaret came back really quickly and said, well, when you're ready. And so we put it together quite quickly. And Margaret, I'm really pleased to have you here, and I'm really enjoying the book. I've read it quite closely after reading Michael Cullen's book, so I can do some cross-referencing as we go through it. And I'd like to welcome you here and thank you for giving up your time to spend it with a bunch of Fabians. Thank you very much, Margaret.
Okay, and thank you very much, Phil, for the invitation. My only disappointment is I thought I could come to Auckland and catch up with a whole lot of people I've been trying to catch up with. Yeah. But this wasn't to be, and so we Zoomed. So I thank you for arranging the Zoom meeting, because I thought that would be good anyway. Yeah. And it's not always the best way to catch up with people, but it's better than nothing. So I'm not complaining. In fact, I'm learning not to complain very much with lockdown. I've decided
just grin and bear it.
Yeah, just.
You've gone on to mute, Margaret.
Okay.
Right.
I think mute is probably the way most people wanted to have me for much of my political life. Anyway, kia ora again, and thank you for the invitation to be with you.
Well, shall I just say that I'll ask Margaret to open with a few words in a minute, and then we'll really basically get into a question and answer discussion, the Q&A process, and get ourselves as close to 8 o'clock as we can, and then finish around that time, about an hour and a half if we can. So Margaret, it's a very interesting book, and I love the title. I thought it was really good to have a book on the shelves which starts with the word activism at the moment. So can I perhaps I should ask by just saying a little bit about how the book came to be.
Thank you for that, Terry.
Is there somebody there that needs to turn their
mute off? I think.
Mute off.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks. That's good. Yeah, no, I know the problem actually, because I seem to spend half my life on Zoom these days. Yes, I think I wouldn't mind just explaining a little bit, I suppose, about the context of the book. It took some time, about 2 or 3, maybe 4 years in the end, to finally get it to the publisher. But I write it not only because I think you reach a certain stage in life, and as I said in the book, I hadn't expected to live this long, so I hadn't planned anything. And I thought it might be good to just reflect on what it's all been about, really. And I had a bit more time as I was leaving the university. So to be able to write what I wanted to write as opposed to what academics were expected to write. So that was quite a luxury. So it started, I guess, personally, but it also came out of, I was asked often to make some comments on some of the experiences I'd had. And I thought I need to put this into a coherent fashion. And then my real impetus for writing it is when I heard someone scream boomer in a rather derogatory way somewhere, and I can't remember where. And I suddenly thought, oh, that's me. And that was the generation, in fact, that was being abused, well, verbally abused, I suppose. That might be a little strong, but that's how I felt. And it then occurred to me, of course, when you get older, you forget that a lot of people don't really understand. Why could they? Because they haven't had your experiences. They haven't lived through your time. And maybe there is a responsibility on us all to be able to reflect on our experiences, not because we see them as better or worse than any others, but because they were a reality at that time. And of course, the old saying that if you don't know your history, you learn to live with it. And it seemed that what would be quite useful for me was then to recall some of the experiences I'd had. And it became demonstrably clear to me that most of my life, of course, is the dominant theme in the book as it became, was working for the equality of women. I knew I couldn't write a a personal memoir as such. My long distant Catholic education made sure that could never happen. So you're always taught to be exceedingly modest about everything and not to actually expose oneself in that way. And I sort of respected that. So I knew I couldn't write that sort of book, but what I could write was more of a political memoir, in the sense of trying to explain why to myself and to others, why I and others did what we did and how we did it. I think the how we do it became important to me, since I've seemed to have spent an enormous amount of my time in meetings, mainly thanks to the Labour Party, I must say, from early days through. And even though the meeting may be going out of fashion because of technology, the meeting was a wonderful political education when I reflected on it. And it seemed to me something that really we may be losing something in terms of how, in fact, we do develop policies and how we, in fact, respond to difference in ways that doing it at a distance isn't always the best way to be able to do this, I think. Anyway, that was just my view. So I wrote the book with trying to explain why I did what I did, and that came from obviously my childhood, my background, my parents, my religion at that time, and then my education became important because I was one of that generation, the terrible boomers, who was the first to go to university, and therefore, of course, didn't realise in many ways, when I reflect, the privilege I had at that time. And having done that, of course, you do move a bit out of your social class and your status in a way. And I remember reflecting on this with my parents, who worked so hard to ensure that we all got a good education, four in the family. But then you do change, and therefore it was very good for me to be grounded and centered by them, in fact, when they would often say they didn't know what on earth I was talking about, because they realized some sort of practical issue that we had overlooked in terms of restructuring society. So it seemed important that educational experience and what that meant to me in the 60s, and particularly as a woman doing law, and as I said in the book, there were few of us. I think we reflected on that and wondered why, but I wouldn't honestly say we were greatly activist. It was the time before you had on-course assessment. So you just had to be sober enough at the end of the year to sit the exam, basically, to get you through, or turn up to compulsory tutorials. And the rest of the time, you did quite a bit of reading, but you did a lot of discussion, talking, a lot of movies, too much drinking, and general sort of experience of life in a way that when I looked back on it, was incredibly valuable, and certainly is not part of university life at the moment. Main reason, there is no time. In other words, the commodity of time was so important for us. And it's only in subsequent years have I come to realise how lucky we were. So it was during that time, that's why I mentioned in the book some of the readings I did, my sort of bit of an odyssey around various political groups and organisations, struggling to find where I felt comfortable without recognising probably there was no comfort zone there, but I certainly learnt a lot at that time. And the reading was extremely important, and none of it was structured. And I find that quite interesting, really. It didn't come out of university texts or reading lists or anything like that. You just sort of picked it up through your discussions, and through one reading led to another reading. And therefore it was a little incoherent, I think, in some ways, a little eclectic, as probably can be seen. But through that, an analysis started to form as to what I personally thought was important to me, and how I should spend what time I had as productively as I could. And that's why I included the chapter on the cancer and the fundamental influence and effect that had on my life. And for no other reason, it said, don't waste any moment. And that was advice that was given to me when I was in Parliament too by a former Solicitor General, very good advice. And that meant that you really had to just get on and do it. And I think our generation, in a way, was not so constrained by what was the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do, because we didn't have all that many choices. We just had to get on and do it. And for me as a woman, getting on and doing it was trying to get a job that paid the rent like others. And I thought that was really important because there was no financial security. And when you're a young woman with a disability and no connections to the law, it became that much more important. So for some peculiar reason, I became a member of the union, very briefly for the Legal Employees Union. And that was great experience because it was the end of the ICNA unionism. So that was, that gave me an insight into a form of unionism, which really is very different from the unionism today. Not necessarily better, I hasten to add, but did actually reflect what was happening. So from there, of course, you can see in the book, I moved on to, once you're involved in these sorts of practical issues, I hadn't intended to be politically involved. I really didn't see myself as an organisation party person. But the reality was, if you're really serious about changing, then you had to attach yourself to some sort of political organisation or movement to work with others, basically, for a common goal. That was the most important thing, was to find a home in a way where you could be challenged, but also feel like you weren't wasting your time, that you were working with others in a common cause. And while that might seem quaint and somewhat old-fashioned, it was really important for some of us at the time. And that's how I found my way to the Labour Party, mainly in the Grey Lynn electorate by canvassing, walking from door to door on the streets of Grey Lynn. Eddie Isby, I think, was the MP at the time. And really, I got an insight that if you did that, you certainly got some nice iced buns at the end of it. And that sort of made it all worthwhile, really. And a lot of conversation and chat and all that sort of thing. So a real sense of being part of something more than yourself was important. One thing led to another, and of course the focus on women. And then because the Labour Party at the time was having to restructure itself as an organisation, as all political organisations do, from almost the post-war generation to the 60s generation, or roughly these dates are obviously very rough, but you could see the changing that was taking place. And that led you into a whole new world, which was a serious world, because the debates and the tactics and the stresses of actually trying to manoeuvre that your position to be accepted taught you a lot at the time, taught me a lot, not much tolerance until later on. But I came to recognise that this was really the other part of my life that was extremely important to me. I believed in rules. And that's, of course, not the reason I did law. I did law because I wanted to earn a living, and earning a living as a woman with a disability was going to be difficult at that time. And I thought lawyers sit down most of the time, so it would be okay, and I should be able to do something. But rules are important. And the Labour Party, as I knew it at that time, and I haven't had, I confess, recent experience, loved its rule book. And it wasn't long before I was on Constitution Committee or on groups and interpreting rules. I also learnt that unions loved rule books. So when I was asked to do education talks with unions about the law or what have you during that period of time, invariably the rule book would come out for an interpretation as well. And when you think about it, rules are all we have if you don't have power. And therefore the rule of law becomes extraordinarily important element of any society if in fact you're to have a peaceful resolution of disputes. So one thing led to another, and as the book says, it then takes me through. I didn't go into much the years when I was president of the Labour Party. I'd done another book some time ago on that, trying to point out that politics is about parties as well as about parliamentarians, and what was happening in the Labour Party at that time. But then moved in also in the end of the second part of the book. I just took, I think it was 4 topics or so of portfolios I'd been involved in with issues that were important to me personally, but also I'd been put into the Clark government at that time, and I was privileged to have the position of being a cabinet minister to be able to try and effect some change and implement that policy. And I finally end up with a chapter on the speaker role. And I must confess, I didn't do due diligence before I took that role, but I thought constitutionally it was important. It was only when I did it, I realized what a shambles it really is, actually, and how important it is, but how little support or understanding there is of the Speaker's role in Parliament, and that if there's to be any constitutional change, that is one institution that would need to be seriously looked at, in my view. So that's in the summary. So I've gone a bit longer than I thought, but gives you an idea of why I did the book, what's in the sort of topics that are in the book, and the progression that's there, and the dominant theme that's there. So open to any questions, comments, differing views. Doesn't matter. Off we go.
Yes. Let's have some questions, Margaret. If I could start with one, I love the way you refer to Eddie Isby introducing you to, as a young woman and as a lawyer, to those old unionists that used to be around in those days with their eyebrows, which birds could build nests, and they were crusty old guys. And that your comment about their love of the rule book's very true. I remember finding the Labor Party, in that sense, finding who the older statespeople were in the Labor Party very daunting, and it took a long time for me to feel that I had much affinity with them. Did the same thing happen to you? Did you find it difficult, that very big generational gap, and the sort of even the experiential gap between coming from, well, I came from Hamilton on a dairy farm, and you came from Morrinsville, and I was mixing with these guys?
I think that's true, and in a funny way it was probably disadvantage, but its advantage was that you were always going to be the outsider.
Yeah.
No one really took you seriously as a challenge to their position or their views or anything like that. And because I met with many of these men, and they were all men, though later there was Connie Purdue, I wanted to learn from them. So I was asking for their experience. I was trying genuinely to understand what they did and why they did it, and what their views were, etc. So I was lucky that I had quite a unique type of entree into the conversations. And then nothing I was going to do was going to embarrass them or be partisan in any particular way. I just wanted to understand how the IC&A system worked, actually, and how bargaining worked. And I did get an insight. And part of that insight was it depended on the skills of these men, who proudly would say they would say they didn't really understand rules and laws and all that nonsense, etc., which wasn't true, of course. But they were very skilled negotiators, and they had been through quite a lot of tough fights. They understood the reality of having a principled position, and that the schisms within the trade union movement that had probably started in the 1890s was still there, basically. And part of my entree, I think, was because the Catholic Action Group knew of my Catholic background, not that I was a practicing Catholic, and that also was important, I think, to give me an understanding of what motivated quite a lot of people to devote their lives to representing other people in quite difficult circumstances, actually, as it is today.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. Can I just suggest people either put a question, wave their hand about if they're on visual, and if they've got a question, or use one of the, is the hand up function down there on the reactions box? Paul Tudor, you've been waving your hand.
Yeah, sorry, I put it in the chat, but I guess you kind of answered the question with the rules and the systems, I guess, but we've got people like Greta Thunberg, the younger generation, and I see Paul Stevens, and you must be the youngest person here, Paul, actually. Is activism the same as it was, or is it enough on its own? I mean, Greta Thunberg, she's made a lot of ways, but it's, yeah.
No,
it's been going for a few years.
I think that is something I did reflect on, actually, because for me it took the form of radical versus, and it was sort of versus socialist feminism. And the radical feminism was very activist, very performance orientated, very important at the moment of getting the issue up there, and very necessary actually to do that. Whereas I always felt, well, that's good, but there's more to it than that. In other words, who's going to pay for it? How is it going to be sustained in a way? And that's why it wasn't difficult for me really to focus on what passed for socialist feminism at the time, and led me reading in that way, and could see it has its own complexity and issues as well. But that to me was important. So activism takes many, many forms, it seemed to me at the end of the day, and is obviously reflective of what works within a particular society. However, if you even reflect on in New Zealand, and I was trying to think of the name of, we had a big strike, I remember, in Auckland at one stage, where there was a young activist woman who generated a lot of activity. And what happened? You know, like, where was the sustainable movement that was behind it? So in other words, to build a movement is extraordinarily important. Now, the Catholic Church that taught me that you don't survive with warts and all for that long a period of time unless actually you've learnt some lessons about how, in fact, you do organise things, and organisation is very important. And it's why when I was president of the Labour Party, I was so strongly of the view that the Labour Party could not split into pieces, because it was very difficult to rebuild a movement. So we keep the name, we keep it. People have the right to come and go, and for the MMP was great because everyone could have their own party. So that helped the Labour Party at that time enormously to enable legitimate political expression without trying to reconcile the irreconcilable internally. So very important to maintain movements. And I think the National Party might be thinking that at the moment. I don't think it changes. And I think it's, you know, all sorts of political parties probably go through the same thing. And Labour will probably go through the same thing too.
Can I see another hand there? Just trying to look around, move the screen around now.
Got the chat here. I'll see if I can.
What's it be in the chat?
What's in the chat? Okay, Paul, have I more or less answered your question? You were, okay, that's good. Next one's from David. What is the shambles of the speaker role? The shambles of the speaker's role is simply this, that the speaker has no power at all. The speaker is like the referee without a whistle, basically, or even a red card, because the speaker only exists at the will of the members. And therefore, if the members want to break all the rules which they themselves formed, they do and did. And I just thought that it sort of, for me, lacked some sort of solidity, some sort of permanence and principle. Now, that's not to say they weren't good individual members who you would give the title parliamentarian to, who understand what the whole purpose of Parliament was about and how it should work in a democratic system. But there were others who didn't, let me put it like that. And I didn't feel, because we lack a constitution that actually has taken the time and trouble to think some of these things through, then you got constant attacks as the speaker for all sorts of things that really had nothing to do what you did, but were a sort of disguised political way to get at the party from which you came. So it was that. The second thing was, I thought it was just not well resourced and well organised, basically. And that was because it all took place on a nod and a wink. And there was a great resistance to writing anything down, and I came to understand why. So people made decisions on an ad hoc basis. And some of those were fine, most of it was fine. But after a while, why would one member of parliament have 3 parking spaces in the Beehive car park, and others were screaming out to get a car park? Yet to find out. Now, these are small matters, I know, but they were indicative of how the place worked. As a rules-based person, I was a killjoy. I knew that. I just wanted a bit more structure, basically.
Paul Chalmers, I think you've got a question. Paul.
Yeah, no, I'm Margaret, just there, a little, I've written it in there. The party is looking to move away from the election of the leader model that we developed some time ago, and had a great tussle getting members on the being able to elect them. And have you been following that, or any comments on it?
No, I'm not the current controversy. It's something that comes and goes, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
But, should caucus control or should the party control? And by and large, it reflects, as far as I can see, really the strength of both or either party. So when the government, or the caucus, I'll use that term, the caucus, the parliamentarians feel they're strong, they don't need the party. And that's just, I think that goes for all parties, not just Labor in a way. So the relationship changes. And that's why I found it quite difficult in the 80s, because you're meant to suck up everything that's given to you just because you're on the same side. But when you found out you weren't on the same side of some of the policies, and neither was half the party members, it became difficult, to sort of do the traditional party caucus relationship.
Yeah.
And then when the party gets really angry because the government or the caucus is not implementing policies or is ignoring them or what have you, then there is an assertion then also. So it's a balance, actually. And to me, it's about a relationship between the two, and it's a hard relationship, I can tell you. It's difficult, and it needs to be worked at constantly. And unless there is constant communication and understanding between the two, if it gets out of kilter, at the moment anyway, it would seem to me it is difficult to be elected to be government without a political party membership. Now, I know memberships come and go, and I know there are other views on this, where they have the presidential page, where the leader becomes the most important, etc., all the literature on that. Or whether, I think in New Zealand, there is a sort of feeling that basically the people should have a say, and somehow how is that going to be expressed becomes important. So if you don't then have a party, then you will, that is pretty clear about and still actively involved in policy making, in ideas, in appropriately holding their members to account and being supportive of their members actually also, then you'll get populism, won't you? You'll get the big leader party sort of thing, and what we've seen in other countries and we could see here. I don't see we'd be immune from that at all. And we have no constitutional framework that can stop any of this, let me say. So it's pretty much always a moving feast.
Thank you for that. I think the compromise that's being suggested is actually quite reasonable, to be honest.
What are they suggesting at the moment?
66% of the caucus supports a particular candidate. Then the caucus have it.
That's not unfair. But so the party has no say at all, or?
I don't think so. I think that if 66% don't, then it's back to the model, which wasn't actually that effective. Well, it was a tortuous model of wandering around the country with candidates, and yes, didn't quite work that well, to be honest. That's why this blowback has come, I think.
Yeah.
Further questions?
Interesting. We'll see.
Yeah. Thank you for that.
I see some. I can imagine some of you have got questions that you're sitting on, but now's the time.
I've just popped a question in there around the Property
Jessica.
Relationships Amendment Act.
Yeah.
I just found that quite it felt like a really important piece of work that you were working on, and I'm sure there were some good other stories that you might be able to add to in terms of kind of managing the criticism of that time.
Yeah, I think that was an interesting example of something that was happening within the community. If like there'd been these social changes that have been taking place over a period of time, and therefore there was lots of criticism, ideas, etc., that the law had to change to be able to provide, if you like, a fairness for people who were in relationships and had acquired properties and assets, etc., over quite long periods of time. And if for whatever reason the relationship broke up, then one party invariably got hardly anything or whatever. So something had to happen, and National had a go at it. But it was sort of interesting because fundamentally you had to accept the equality of women, or not only women, and this is where it came a bit unstuck, nearly unstuck, of the two partners. So a lot of the criticism I got was from the gay community, male gay mainly, who didn't sometimes had a different approach to relationships, maybe some. And the thought of having to then share became a bit difficult. And I said, well, you do the agreements, for goodness sake, if that's the nature of it, as I would say to heterosexual couples as well. I can't see why people are so reluctant to talk about money at the beginning of the relationship as opposed to the end. Now, this is one of my blind spots, you understand, in terms of politics, because the truth is people do find it difficult, I guess. So what the legislation was trying to do was say, well, okay, that's the reality. People do find it difficult to be able to set it out, and things do change. So therefore, the default position will be 50-50 unless you can take it into your own hands and change it. So there was that was difficult for National, I think, to actually get their head around. And though I think there were people within the National Party that certainly wanted to change the law. What complicated it, Jessica, in many ways, was the legislation that was also going through to make sure our laws did not discriminate at all against gay, lesbian, other couples, in a sense. At the time, they were the two couples that were politically dominant. And therefore, we had projects on changing all the laws. So this seemed a step too far to accept that there could be gay marriage as well. So all the issues became a bit entangled at the time. However, I thought we should continue through because you only had 3 years after all, and you weren't quite sure what would happen. So, and it had been in a select committee. Both bills had been in a select committee for some time. So it wasn't like people hadn't had an opportunity to express their views, unlike happening at the moment on some issues. So therefore, I was really grateful that the Cabinet just said, oh, well, let's have a go. And off we went. And it wasn't a top priority, I don't think. And I don't know how many votes there were in that sort of policy, but it was an issue. His time had come for some sort of solution. Now, what surprised me was that it lasted as long as it did without having some sort of review, because there were compromises that were made on the way towards it. And I remember at the time I was particularly grateful to some members of the Green Party, actually, that were very supportive of getting it through the Select Committee and generally trying to iron out some of the issues. But I see now it's back with the Law Commission for a review, and they've come out with a report.
It must be the gender discrimination.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, I wasn't sure what that was about, but So I'll be interested to see what the amendments are, because relationships change in society. So therefore the law should change. And I wouldn't, and I think they have to reflect what those changes are. Our attitudes about children have changed. So that's when you really need some good policy work that needs to be done.
And I suppose at the time it would have felt like it was a time for change within society, that this was something that was needing to be addressed and looked at. So
yeah, and therefore the pushback wasn't as great as people said it would be.
Yeah.
And that's a political judgment with a lot of issues, that how you sort out the rhetoric of the moment from what will be sustainable long-term criticism, I guess, which means that whatever you're doing probably won't be very effective. And the fact that that lasted as long as it has and will continue to last in different forms said, you're right. It was time had come, so therefore you had to just take a deep breath and do it, and then wait for the world to collapse, and it didn't.
Catherine, sorry, Jessica.
No, you're right. I'm just saying thank you for that.
Yeah, Catherine, you've got a question in the chat. Do you want to bring us to it?
Sure. Hi, Margaret. Oops, my camera. I was not planning. Hi, Margaret. It's been great. Yeah, I just put it in there since she was reading questions from the chat earlier, so I thought she wanted to do the same. But I like listening to any of Margaret's stories. She knows that. But one thing I have thought is people still, because I'm doing a lot of environmental law, and people are still they're still pandering to vested interests in the slightest hint. Just take recently water quality, Southland cows, winter grazing. We're going to come up with all these rules. Oh, okay, no, we'll take that one back if you fuss too much. There's one, but there's still the cameras on fishing boats. I mean, you name it. As soon as someone fusses, they go, okay, well, they either back off or they don't do it in the first place. And we thought, okay, under national, it's because these are their national and New Zealand first. We thought, okay, these are the people donating, but we're still seeing it now. And I wondered if you have any thoughts from your time inside about what's going on or how to do something about it.
Well, I think this is just my experience, and I was faced with this particularly with the Supreme Court, interestingly, because the special interests were strong. They were the media, though there were several issues when I think about it, but that was clear cut because the legal profession is a powerful lobby, and it didn't all speak with one voice, and why should it? So it was a question and because there'd been several attempts to try and get this legislation through, but it had always died at the fence of special interests. And one of those special interests within the legal profession, the other special interest, if you can call it a special interest given to Reti, were Maori, but not all Maori. So the point I'm making was that once I worked out where were the real points of contention, where were the legitimate concerns that really had to be addressed in the legislation in some form or another, if it was to be sustainable. So sometimes a seen as special interests do have a good argument. So what then becomes important is the process that can, as objectively as possible, look at that and then try and see if there is an accommodation or not. Now, sometimes you can't. Like, yes, we were going to get rid of appeals. There was no compromise there. How you got rid of them and what you did, etc., was another issue. So that means you've got to be quite active. You've got to have ministers who actually are quite on top of their brief in terms of knowing what the policy issues are, what the various arguments are. They need to be backed up by good officials also that are thinking themselves about and trying to work through in a constructive way. So it goes back to me as to the whole process that goes into making the policy that goes in the legislation. And then the lawyers become involved because they have to express it in legislation. And sometimes by involving them in what seems like a policy debate, you can find ways through, actually. So it's been very active, I suppose, and knowledgeable about what you're trying to achieve. So I'm not so dismissive of special interests, though sometimes I know that irritates you to death because they don't agree with you. but sometimes I've learned quite a bit by actually listening. So, for example, and you won't like this example, I'm sure, Catherine, but on the climate change, I'm in the Waikato. Are we going to get rid entirely of dairy farming? And are we prepared to take the consequences of that? And if we are, what is our time frame and how are we going to do it? So we're going to disrupt the lives of, hundreds of thousands of people just locally, let alone nationally, to get rid of all these cows. Or we're going to find ways, to address it. So I guess that's my fundamental approach. Disappointing for some, but it's what I've learned, I suppose.
Turn them all into sheep. milking sheep.
Goats.
All goats. Yeah, Trudy. Thank you, Catherine. Trudy, you have a question in the chat as well. Quite an interesting one. Trudy, you there?
Trudy's saying, is she up here?
What is your views on MPs who have no recent work experience outside the beehive?
Oh dear.
Are you with us, Trudy? You've got your mic on
mute.
Mute. So if you could click yourself on, it'd be good. It's about MPs with no recent work experience and are they valuable in the workload? And what about the MPs who stay on too long? That's never happened.
I don't know. I mean, I came to the conclusion there is, within our gene pool, there is a small gene of some people born to be politicians from the day they are born. And therefore, they can go through and have very productive lives as parliamentarians. They are very rare and few in number. I'm of the view that it's always good to have plan B and to have had some life experience probably outside not only politics, I suppose, but that can be very valuable, but it also has its own constraints. And it means that whether you like it or not, your own networks then become quite narrow. So it's important to be able to have as diverse of views as possible that you've come across in your working life. I don't know about part of people staying too long is money. And if there's not a proper superannuation system and et cetera, these people will cling on to forever. I mean, probably not a diplomatic answer, but that has been my experience. The other thing, though, to be fair, for some people, it's wondering what they're going to do next. And if you've been a Labor politician, it's really hard to find a job. Actually, it might be easier now, but it's certainly, I didn't necessarily find it very easy. And we're not very generous to the experience that former politicians can have. At least Labor's not, in my experience, all that generous. If you run a business or a farm or something, then you've got those sorts of networks. So I think that it's complicated in that sense. Money's important, but also role and contribution, and how our society actually does treat older people anyway. And that's going to become a real policy issue soon as the numbers grow. And there will be competition for resources, etc. But also the skills may well be needed also as we face some shortages in terms of those skills. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Trudy and Margaret. Charlotte, you've got a question there. Do you want to read it out or put it to Margaret?
Thanks. Thanks, Margaret. So my question is really, as someone who's been involved in justice system reform, obviously, what do you think comes next? I think we've sort of got to this point, it seems, where it's sort of the next frontier. We've got to deal with a system that seems to be crumbling somewhat, but there's a huge level of inertia. But also, I think, lack of clarity about what to do other than chuck money at the thing, which nobody wants to do. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's certainly not an easy one. I'd be the first to say that, because I think in a way now for me, the law should provide a dispute resolution mechanism that is cheap and that is timely. Now, that's your ideal, and that's why, of course, what happened was the development of alternative dispute resolution mechanisms that are not always timely or cheap, I hasten to add, so I'm fully much aware of that. But that was also an attempt to say the court system isn't good at finding solutions to some forms of legal problems. And that goes back, I think, to two things. One is the way we frame our laws. How much time and consideration do we really give to the drafting of laws in terms of trying to take into account the impact of those laws? What in fact are going to be the consequences of it, and was there another way of doing it or framing it? So I put that out there, but then there's also the whole court system. And I don't know, as people are always reforming the courts, but they never actually reform them. And I noticed that some of the reforms have been pretty much associated with that neoliberal approach to public policy. That I remember once when someone thought that you could fund the courts by all the court fees that were paid. Well, if that was just ridiculous, but unfortunately that became the basis of a policy that, if never fully implemented, certainly didn't help, because that showed a chronic lack of understanding that justice is actually a public good. And it was that fundamental sort of basis with which you have to start. So therefore it might cost you something. And in costing you something, it may actually enhance then what happens within your society. So you won't get the same levels of conflicts and stress that in fact we often endure, because people have a great sense of unfairness. Look at what's happening now with the legal aid system. And you can just go around, and I feel it's a neglected area, to be quite frank. It's not seen as important enough. And yet it's, as I've said before, because I believe in rules and I believe in the rule of law and I believe in the institutions that support it, it should be. And therefore it's not. And we are seeing some of the consequences because people take the law into their own hands. And at times they don't see why should they actually abide by rules, as we're seeing at the moment with COVID, of course. There are sections of society that these rules just don't mean anything. They're not part of their universe, really. So there's no fundamental understanding of the importance of having an acceptance of a way in which you actually resolve disputes.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that helps. I'm not going to come up with some clever ideas. I've had giving some another context, but anyway.
Simon, you had a question and then withdrew it and got another one. So which one do you want to ask?
Well, you kind of answered it, Margaret, but I had a question about the Supreme Court, which was something where you drove it in face of huge opposition. And 5 minutes after it had happened, you just wouldn't understand why that opposition had ever been there. And I guess my question is really governing, and should a government do what is right, or should a government do what it thinks it can get away with or won't be unpopular, and can you easily tell those things apart? And the other question I had is, I can't find anything unkind about anybody in your book, and are there things you would have liked to have said that you didn't?
Oh, of course, answering the second question. But what's the point? I mean, I never learned there's much point. And I have sort of quite meaningful conversations with Madam, my life companion at the moment, who is a ragdoll cat. And her response is normally to go to sleep if I, in fact, have an expletive. So I've come to the conclusion that talking to her is about the best way to resolve that. I just genuinely don't see the point, because to me, life's about relationships, good ones, bad ones, and different ones, relationships that change. And unless you're constantly attuned to that, and recognition of the difficulties it is to sustain any sort of relationship, actually, not only personal, but political or social or what have you, then you've got to give some time and energy and a bit of tolerance to it. You learn that with experience. And on the Supreme Court, I got the feeling, and it happened in the labour relations stuff as well, I became the problem for the media. It was quite personal. And once I'd worked my way through the Supreme Court stuff and realised that actually the whole system of law was not going to collapse once we did this. In fact, there'd be a great sigh of relief around the place. You're right. So the Herald stopped putting front page, and I went to see the editor of the Herald. I thought maybe a face-to-face to explain to him that in fact there wasn't a Privy Council any longer, that in fact because of the changes constitutionally that's taken place in the UK, the whole nature and process of the Privy Council had fundamentally shifted. Of course, what I found was he didn't care. Of course, he didn't know, but he didn't care. That was not really the story. So once you realise you're dealing with people that really have quite positions of power, actually, in terms of what goes on the front page of it, but they don't care about the substance of it. You knew then if you got it over the line, the world wasn't going to change detrimentally, that in fact you'd be okay. So if I thought he'd had some real arguments that would have sustained him, then I would have listened. Obviously, that would have been a sensible thing to do, but I didn't. And I must say that most of the arguments, interestingly, had come from the business community. And the business community, the Privy Council was formed to support the business community in the colonies. Now, once you understood the history of this institution, it became perfectly clear to me why they had maintained their support for it. And therefore, it really wasn't working in the interests of the vast majority of New Zealanders at all. It was like a private dispute resolution club, because by and large, they're the only ones who could afford to go to it. And, I went to the Privy Council actually to have a look at it just to see. Actually quite shabby, I thought that, and the chairs were so uncomfortable, and the whole process lacked sort of, I don't know, gravitas in a way. And I kept on thinking, what, even in just as an experience. But anyway, people thought they were dealing with great minds. So be it. So that's it. I don't know if that answers your question, but on that, I felt, no, it's not only I'm actually the problem, it's not the issue. And if my colleagues are prepared to support me, and thanks to Helen, I think that's why we got over the line after Peter, what's his name? Aharia, was it?
Peter Dunn.
Peter Dunn withdrew his support at the very last minute. We had the numbers, but they were small, and some people kept on saying this was a great constitutional change and, had all these implications. And I wish it would have been a great constitutional change, but it wasn't, because we haven't got a constitution. So it seemed to me that we could do it, and got away with it in the sense that it wasn't going to do any great harm.
I see now why you built it such a beautiful building.
Well, I think that I like performance, for goodness sake. Law loves performance, and it's extremely important that people feel that the environment in which they are is taking them seriously by not putting them in some place that doesn't take them seriously. Yeah, I quite liked it, actually.
Margaret, going back to the people you mentioned in the book, I was really chuffed to hear you, or to see you mention a lovely Waikato politician, Dorothy Jealous, in the book.
Yeah.
Just take my hat off to Dorothy every time I think about her.
I think, as I said in the book, that Labor women of my generation followed really wonderful women of previous generations, and Dorothy was one of them, actually. And fought the fight to the end, really. She just never forgot who she represented, whether it be in her union work, or whether it be in politics, or whether it be in her interrelationships with people, exceptional.
And her family, yeah.
Her family, extraordinarily important to her.
Yeah.
Extraordinarily important, yeah. A lot of good.
Sorry, Paul Stevens, you've got a question. Paul?
Yes. Yes, thank you, Phil. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I apologize if I'm asking you to read tea leaves a little bit, Margaret, but I'm interested in your opinion about how things are heading with the Labour Party. In New Zealand, we can reflect that perhaps we've headed towards a politics of personality, and we can become, as a country and as a Labour Party, very enraptured by Jacinda. But I'm interested about what you think the future of that might be, because I sometimes worry that her brand is bigger, perhaps, than Labour has become. So I'm interested to hear what you think might be the future for us, and reflecting on your own experience and thinking a bit about what you've just said about performance, how we might reflect on that to find a way forward if we no longer have the benefit of a personality.
It's an interesting question, because I think it's a mistake to think that New Zealand hasn't often had big personalities as prime ministers, you know, going back to the 1890s and on, and we like them. Actually, we like big personalities. And in recent times, I mean, whatever you thought of Muldoon, he was a big personality. And if you thought, obviously, of David Lange, you know, so you can actually pick out, if you go back, and in their day, I'm sure Michael Joseph Savage, etc. So leadership is always important and never to be underestimated. I confess, when I was much, much younger, I didn't see the importance of leadership. I thought the collective was more important. But I came through having my weekly meetings with David Lange. In the 3 years I was president, I met every Thursday, I think it was, for an hour with David. And I came to understand what leadership was about and not about in some ways, and the stresses and strains that there were on those who seek leadership, but also then have to support others through their leadership becomes important. So I think Jacinda sort of follows a line of really strong leaders. She's totally different from past leaders, but that's not to say that the qualities of leadership are not the same that's there. People believe her. People support her. They like her approach to what she's doing and to trying to solve difficult problems. So her performance, if you want to put it like that, I think is also totally consistent with what is acceptable for the times, whereas it wouldn't have been in the 1970s, I can tell you, you know. So it's about trying, and how we do it, I don't know, and all parties have to try and do this, is get a leader that in fact is in sync with the majority of the people at the time. Now, we have that, and it's very hard to replicate it with the next leader, as also history will tell you. So if you take a step back, and this doesn't matter what party it is, you find that very difficult to grow the next leader, and people keep on saying, why didn't you prepare someone for the job, or what have you? It's very hard to do that because of the competitive nature of politics to begin with, but also because people look for different things in terms of the timing. So Labor, I think, will go through, because it just seems to be part of the process. And while it's done extremely well up to now, post-COVID will be a totally new world. Now, what will be interesting to know, that many of the skills that Jacinda has probably will assist with that post-COVID world, interestingly, but it will depend who is going to have the dominant interests in that world. And a lot of her support, is, if I read the polls right, saying do come from women and not from men. And yet, if you look at the levers of power in this country, they're still firmly held by men, not by women. And therefore, you're looking at more than just style. She's more than style, but you're looking to see then what are going to be the opportunities, in fact, to address some of those issues that are really in the privilege of those who have financial and economic power. And I guess that's always been the case. And she has enormous social power and really is not equaled with it. But as things change, the country will change, the expectations will change, then I guess that's the challenge for Labor, And while I'm sure Jacinda will stay for as long as she wishes to stay, eventually, like all leaders, she will also go. And then that will be the decision that the party has to face. So if you're talking then about changing your leadership rules, well, then whoever's in your caucus becomes really important, isn't it? So if the caucus members reflect a different reality than what's actually in the community, you're unlikely to get a leader that will have the support of the majority in the community. They may have the support of the majority in the caucus, but not necessarily. So it's really important, while certainly you've got to focus on your leader, because the leader is in what people see and expectations are, but what sits and stands behind the leader in caucus becomes, to me, equally important in times of stress. And I'm not sure I'm familiar enough with who's in the caucus at the moment and what their views are, but do they have leadership positions and are able themselves to reflect a community of policy interest that in fact is likely to attract the majority of people at the next election after Jacinda goes.
Bruce, I see you've got a comment in the chat. Do you want to make it a question or just leave it at that? Bruce Errol.
Oh, probably about
cows.
Yes, being 20% of our GDP, hard to find a replacement quickly, in which case then I couldn't agree more.
Yes.
I've one of my roles down here at the moment, I'm interested in food security. I mean, just generally.
Yeah.
So these are very serious and hard questions. And while the young woman from Sweden can tell us we're all terrible and horrible and we're not doing enough, and she may be right on one area, she doesn't actually have to make sure that the people of Waikato, in fact, have a...
David Cook, do you want to put your question?
Oh, well, kia ora, thank you very much. The MMP is, it's the anniversary of MMP. Last night's narrative on Radio New Zealand was that Labor first introduced it, then Geoffrey Palmer got cold feet. National didn't want it, but thought they could use it against Labor, so they brought it forward. What was your reading of that?
Oh, well, my reading was that Geoffrey had always supported MMP, and that's why he'd set up in the 80s his Royal Commission, wasn't it, on electoral reform or what have you, and it's still a really good document to go back and reflect and read. The colleagues understandably were not supportive because first past the post has an enormous attraction to sharing power, and both because you think you can get things done and what have you. So there was a lot of, but there was always within the Labor Party groups of people that did support MMP. I must confess, if I'd thought about it, I reflected a status quo position, but as president of the Labor Party, it was the only salvation for the Labor Party that I could see was MMP, to give the democratic choice for people who didn't agree with what was happening to form their own parties with a legitimate expectation of getting into Parliament. And that's precisely what happened, rather than doing what the Australians did when they had differences in their party and formed factions, because once you form factions, it's really hard then to get a collective unity position going forward. So always supported it. I was with Geoffrey, if you want stories, the night we were sitting there watching David Longy's interview on television, where he misread a script and committed us to MMP. We both looked at each other and couldn't believe it because we knew that was not David. But he stuck to it, actually, since we obviously made attempts to find out really quickly if this was going to be where we go going forward. And David, to his credit, said yes, and I think he, like many others, thought it would never happen. I don't know about National. The only thing I know is I read in one of the presidents of the National Party at the time, who was as surprised as Geoffrey and I were when Bolger announced that they would actually support a referendum on MMP. So I think it was sort of like a leader's choice in both National and Labor. And again, because no one who had been in Parliament, or not all, some people did obviously, but many in and Parliament didn't believe people would vote for it. I personally thought they would, because it was payback time. And, you know, people underestimate that if people get an opportunity to directly express their views, they will express them. And just about all the polls told you that was going to happen if you actually read them properly. And so it was. And to the credit, I think, of all those members of Parliament, they stuck to that. And then they actually devised a system of MMP that worked reasonably well. And they did that even though most of them probably didn't agree with it. So that was the strength of the system.
Margaret, there's an element in your book which is quite strong, but we haven't talked about tonight, and that is your experience with as a treaty negotiations minister.
Oh,
and the incredible weight of responsibility and skill that puts upon anybody to manage. And you did a good time with it, and there's lovely photographs. I actually would like to compliment you on the time you gave, or the space you gave in the book to photographs. There's a good number of photographs which bring back some memories. Yeah. And in particular, there's a lovely one of you sitting in front of a marae with the negotiating team.
Yeah, I thought with the photos that, and I'm not in all of them, and I said the photos were to reflect the time as well and some of the issues, because I'm personally a more visual person in many ways, and I think most people are. And if we have them, they get lost, you know, so let's try and preserve as many as we can. And with the digital now, you just wonder how photos are going to survive. I don't know how many others have, you know, you put them on your computer, but what do you do then? Anyway, so photos are good. The treaty was very difficult. And because when I became treaty minister, I found letters that hadn't been responded to for over a year. There was no infrastructure for treaty settlements. It was like, we've done the big two and that's it. And then there was some negotiations with individuals and some that didn't get over the line when I became minister, so then had to try and sort out some that have never been sorted out, to be honest. And part of the problem was, I think, that, and I try to do this in the book, I didn't spend a lot of space on treaty because you could write several books, but one was national thought, once you did the treaty settlement, that was it. It was over and done with. Compensation had been paid and it would all go away somehow. And right from the outset, I said, no, this is an ongoing relationship, as the treaty was, and the settlements are part of that ongoing relationship. So anything that's agreed to here has to be seen as a platform for whatever comes next. It's not the end, it's actually just a stage in the developing of the relationship. So again, I saw the relationship as being most important. I think I have nothing but admiration for the officials that worked on this. I think it's true that money was an issue, but it wasn't the only issue, to be honest. The issue was more sharing of power and how we were going to do it. And I'm not sure we've resolved that, but at least it's now front of house, so to speak, at the moment. And I'm thinking particularly about the health reforms, and I'll be very supportive and interested to see how they work out. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Margaret. Are there any further questions here? I don't think there's anything more in the chat. Are there any further questions?
No, I don't see anything that I wasn't sure if David was
yeah, Bruce is waving his fingers, his hand in the air. Okay. Bruce, you've got to turn your mute off.
Yeah, hi, Margaret. I work in healthcare, and I've been reading some fourth wave feminist stuff from Amir Srinivasan in Oxford. She's a 36-year-old Indian woman. She's just written a book, and she claims that the judiciary is still patriarchal, and that in cases of sexual assault, perhaps we should be taking into account the past history of an assailant. In medicine, we wouldn't make a diagnosis without knowing what had gone on somebody before. Otherwise, we would make a wrong judgment. And it seems to me law sticks to that thing of you're innocent till proven guilty. But in logic and behavioral science, past behavior predicts future behavior. And my son was recently on a jury, and if he'd known the past history of the assailant, he probably would have found him guilty. But you know, there was some doubt, as there often is in sexual assault, and the person got off, and then they found out they had this horrendous history. So they probably were guilty, but they were found innocent. So your view?
No, it's I've just bought her book. So
fabulous, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm just struggling to find a bit of time to read it. but yes, it's top of the list. I think that raises one of the, I think it was someone asked a question about the justice system, Jessica, I think. Was it doesn't matter, but it's fundamental that the individual that comes before the court, as we know, should be judged on the specific crime with impartially. And there's been a sort of tolerance for that approach. And I guess I have often wondered now increasingly whether or not, in fact, the admission of other evidence is, the pressure for that is going to become greater. The thing that holds me back a bit is that everybody's backstory is different. And really what the justice system is saying, we are holding you account for the actions you have performed and can be proven. We are not judging in a way whether you had a chance in life through being brought up with violence yourself and et cetera, et cetera. That's not our job. Our job is, in fact, to judge on the particular event. It's the job of rest of society or other institutions to address those other issues. And of course, I suppose to some extent it's been left rather inadequately to those who are incarcerated. However, the struggle these days with trying to keep up with social media and other forms of technology becomes a constant struggle for the courts to know just how much do jurors really know before they go into jury rooms and how much they don't, which comes back again, who are we being judged by anyway in terms of the type of experience that people have who sit on juries. I'm raising more questions than I'm answering, with some, but all I'm saying, I think they are questions we are going to have to address in a way. I'm personally quite reluctant to look beyond the specific event and what it means. But at the same time, if that's all we do, then the same people will keep on coming before the courts with the same sort of offences. So what's the purpose? We've got to do some backing up to the justice system, I think, to make sure that doesn't happen. Not a very satisfactory answer, because I know what you're saying, but the laws, as I'm finding as a Deputy Commissioner at the Waikato DHB, is a bit different from medicine. In fact, the complexities are both there in both professions, but they are a bit different.
We would get a lot of wrong answers if we did not take into account what had happened. I'll put the name of the book there. I think I've spelled her name correctly. It's called The Right to Sex, History of Fourth Wave Feminism. Every page is confronting, I have to say.
Yes. Well, that's why I got it, because there's not a lot of good, well, I can't find a lot of writing I can relate to, but hers seemed great, that direct, fronting the issues with trying to find solutions to them. And I think that's what we desperately need in New Zealand at the moment as well, actually, for what it's worth. So you're right. Of course, we're not likely in the law to kill anybody if we don't do the backstory, whereas, of course, you might.
Are there any further questions out there? I can see several names who I could imagine had a question. Margaret, I really appreciate the amount of time and effort you put into this. It's been a bit of a tour de force and not knowing exactly where all the questions are going to come from. You've had to be rather quick on your feet and quick in your seat. and coming up with responsible and effective answers, which you've done brilliantly. And I'd like to thank you for the time and effort you've put in. I'll just see if there's one more question out there. Yeah, I can see a few claps. I'm very pleased to think that there's an appreciative audience, Margaret, and I do wish you well.
Thank you, Phil. And I just wanted to put a word of thanks for Bridget Williams' books, because it's been published without her publishing it. It's not easy to get that type of book published in New Zealand. So any support that could be given to BWB I'd be grateful for, not just my book, but them as New Zealand publishers of non-fiction. Actually, it's very important we keep that alive. So thank you.
People